Hey guys, welcome to the Thursday edition of this special episode we're doing this week for Holy Week. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Pastor Justin along with Jeff and Austin, and thank you again. We appreciate your support of this podcast, and we hope if this has been a blessing to you that you will like it, you'll follow, you'll share, and we would love for more people just to listen to us as we just really kind of talk out of the overflow of what we talked about on Sunday, but this has been kind of a special week since it's the Easter holiday season that we're celebrating the significance of it. And today is Thursday as we look at really what happens in the upper room the day before Jesus goes to the cross and dies. And there's so much that's happening in this upper room discourse, really found for us in Matthew 26, verse 17 through the end of the chapter, and then also one of the most well-known passages for the upper room discourse is John 13 through John chapter 17, those 5 chapters there. And so I'll just read this first just kind of verse in Matthew 26, verse 17. It says, "On the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, 'Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?'" And so I'm going to ask Austin to just read an excerpt from his Bible notes about what this Passover is, just to give us a little better understanding of what was going on during that time. Austin, read it for us.
Yep, it says the first day of unleavened bread. The Aramaic reads, "On the day before the Passover festival." This was the first day of an 8-day celebration to commemorate the deliverance of the Hebrew slaves out of Egypt. The Jews would eat of a roasted lamb after sunset in a family group of at least 10 people. The meal would include bitter herbs in remembrance of their bitter years of slavery, unleavened bread, and 4 cups of wine mixed with water.
Okay, so he said there 8 days celebration, and we know they really celebrated the Passover on Friday. But the disciples and Jesus are having it a day early because we know that Jesus is going to be this Passover lamb that is what the Passover represented back in Exodus when they observed this, and they would take that lamb, they would sacrifice the lamb, they would take the blood and wipe it on the doorpost of the house, and then the death angel would pass by. And so now Jesus has been this lamb that's going to be slain from the foundation of the world, and it's all coming to fruition tomorrow. But here is what Jesus is doing. He is having this last meal with his disciples, and many times it's called the Last Supper, but inside the Last Supper, he institutes what's called the Lord's Supper that we observed the Lord's Supper on this past Sunday about, the bread and the juice, how it represents the body that was beaten and bruised for us and the blood that was shed for us. And so this is what's happening in these verses. And also, Jesus is telling his disciples what is getting ready to happen. And, John 13 and especially John 14, he says, "Don't let your heart be troubled." So these guys were deeply distressed about what was going on, and they just didn't understand it all at this point. I mean, Jesus is getting ready to go away. He tells them, "Man, I'm going away, but I'm coming again." And, so they didn't really understand fully what was getting ready to happen. And then, of course, Jesus, too, you got to imagine the weight of what is going on in that upper room, where he says, "One of you is going to betray me." And boy, they all, like we said, yesterday, we know it's Judas, but they didn't know it at the time who it was. They didn't know it was Judas because they all said, "Lord, is it I? Is it me? Am I going to be the one to betray you?" And then, of course, you have Jesus there washing their feet, which is amazing to me. And then he institutes the Lord's Supper, and of course, then he talks to Simon Peter about how Simon Peter's going to deny him, and Peter's like, "Well, no, I'm not going to do that. I'll die with you," And I believe he really thought that. And then, of course, they leave there and go to Gethsemane. So we're going to talk a little bit about the upper room, and then we're going to talk about Gethsemane because I believe it's so important as we kind of get around that garden, which is amazing, where creation started in a garden. Here's Jesus in a garden of Gethsemane, and he goes to another garden where he's crucified, So it's pretty powerful what we're studying this week. So let's talk a little bit about the upper room, and then we'll get to Gethsemane about what all was going on there.
Upper room was a very busy place, and just a lot of things that were taking place there. you've also got a lot of spiritual antagonism in that upper room. There's just there is concern. There's a lot of questions, probably a lot of murmuring, I guess, amongst the group as they begin to meet together. When Jesus throws this out to the group there in Matthew 26:21, that truly I say to you that one of you will betray me. There is this feeling within that, most of those guys around the room, as you just said, regarding Peter and his denial, these guys probably said, we would never go to such lengths to do something like that. But then there's always that pause, humanely speaking, that, am I really capable of doing such a thing? And so they turn inward and they begin to ask themselves, this question from within, could I do that? Is it I? And, Judas even poses the same question to Jesus there in verse 25 of that chapter. It says this, and Judas, who was betraying him, said, surely it's not I, Rabbi. Mm-hmm. And Jesus said to him, you've said it yourself. So what did Judas say, and why did Jesus say that? Well, it's within that deceptive question that Judas asked that Jesus said, within what you just said, you're saying it.
Mm-hmm. I think more of a modern aspect of it, and it's just kind of funny because you see it on social media and stuff, but there's a thing that I've seen video where it goes through each of the disciples and it says, is it I, Jesus? And he's like, no, like just in his head, like he knows the answer. But then you have it where somebody's being Judas and it's like, is it me, Jesus? And then he like kind of gives a little bit sarcastic back, like, is it me, Jesus? Like side eyes him, like, of course it's you. Like Jesus knows it was him, Yeah. I think that's kind of funny.
Yeah. And I think too, what all goes on in the upper room. I mean, here is Jesus. In John 13, he begins by, John records washing the disciples' feet, and which is an act of, the lowliest slave in the house in this day. I mean, this was not whoever was the lowest servant in the house. This was their job. So when people come into the house, they would take their sandals off and they would wash their dirty feet. And this is what Jesus is showing. And he's, in the hour when he needed them the most, he's showing them how much of a servant that he really is. And we talk about servant leadership. I mean, you can't really lead without being a servant, and so this is what I see in this is that the hour when they should have been consoling Jesus and comforting Jesus is he's the one doing it to them, and he's the one that's getting ready to pay for their sins. And I mean, he washes Judas's feet, the guy that was going to betray, the guy that's about to betray him, that has already made the deal, and he's still sitting there with him. And he knows this, but yet he gets down, humbles himself, and washes his feet, and does it to Simon. And Simon's the one that betrays him later on and says, I don't even know who you're talking about. I mean, to me, that is powerful. I remember when I graduated from Bible college, and it wasn't fully understood at the time, but when we graduated Bible college, they gave us our diploma, and they gave us a towel, and it had this verse of scripture imprinted on it, and it was showing us that, you got your diploma as a Bible college graduate, congratulations, but this is what you're graduating to do. You're graduating to be a servant.
Right.
And that's what Jesus did in the night before he died, is he was washing and he was washing people's feet that was going to forsake him, that was going to deny him, that was going to betray him. I think it's a powerful thing, and it's not meaning we got to go around and wash people's feet. It just means we're supposed to serve and love people.
You bet.
So
I saw this kind of played out for me once before a few years ago in the example of Pastor Bill Kendrick, who was as near and dear a friend to me and a mentor and an example when we started serving as an interim pastor at Daniel Boone Baptist Church. Bill's oldest son, Mike, passed away. And if I'm not mistaken, and I think I've got it pretty close here, Pastor Bill was going to be filling in for me at Daniel Boone We'd already kind of had that date lined up because I think maybe Anita and I were going to be out of town. But here's the thing. The week leading up to his filling in at Daniel Boone, I believe, was the same week that his oldest son passed. And I just remember thinking, you don't need to be worrying about that. You've got family matters that you need to attend to here. And Pastor Bill still kept that appointment because that's just who he was. A servant's heart for people like few, if any, that I'd ever met up to that point. But folks like that just personify this willingness to get down, to lower themselves. Some people think of humility as some form of oppression, as if to say, that you're just, I'm nothing more than a lowly worm. And that's not it at all. It's just our willingness to defer to God's will and to people. And this picture of Jesus washing Judas's feet is just, to me, an example of just how patient and long-suffering that God the Son was willing to be with the man who would betray him. He's still being patient in the moment, but he also knew the foreknowledge of God the Son, how this was going to ultimately play out, but he was still, in that moment, picturing for us patience and long-suffering. And that's just, to me, it's just an incredible thing. It is.
And it was a picture, too, of what they were supposed to do because he's leaving. And he even tells them that. He said, this isn't the new command, is to love one another. And one of the greatest way you can show somebody you love them is by serving them.
Right. Also picture this, Last Supper that they're sharing together. Jesus throws this incredible shock and awe out in the middle of the room that one of you is going to betray me. And when they start asking, who is it? Who is it I? It's not I, is it, Lord? Then Jesus, in verse 23 of Matthew 26, he says, it's the one who dipped his hand with me in the bowl. Some people have ventured to say that at the moment that he turned to serve Judas, he makes that statement as if to say, it's this guy.
But they still didn't know it.
And they still did not pick up on it, which again is one of those, it's an understanding here that Judas was that trusted amongst the group. It could have been that Jesus at that moment had the bowl in his hand and said, it's the one who's going to dip his hand in the bowl, and I'm doing it right here with him.
Well, in John it says kind of the same thing. It says they were asking, and then Peter says, hey, John, because John was sitting closest to Jesus, hey,
who's he talking?
Who's he talking about? Yes. And so it says Jesus replied, he is the one I give the piece of bread to after I've dipped it. When he had dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, Simon Iscariot's son. After Judas ate the piece of bread, it says Satan entered him, and Jesus said, what you're doing, do quickly.
Oh, my goodness. Justin.
And they still didn't get it.
This thing right here it carries with it some great weight of implication, because to share a meal in that day and age within Jewish culture was huge. You didn't just break bread with anyone. And so what Jesus is doing is he is sharing the most intimate of meals with his closest followers. And the fact that Judas was willing to take that from Jesus, with him serving him, and take it in like he's one of the group that is above board, so to speak. The fact that Judas did that and still walked away to continue with this conspiracy is, that just takes this to another level.
Oh, yeah.
He was fully in command of the decision that he made. He was fully responsible for this. Yeah. So
because that next verse is, right there it tells him, it says, what are you planning to do? Go do it now. And he told him, yes, he commanded it,
Yeah, and it says that none of those that were reclining at the table, which we know it was the disciples, they didn't know what he was talking about. They thought, and it goes on to say, they thought that they needed something for the festival that he was going to go buy. They still didn't get it that, but it says after receiving the piece of bread, he immediately left, and it was night.
It would be a lot easier and more clear to us if there was something in Scripture for us here that said that one of the disciples maybe looked at the others or looked at someone and said, "Hey, where's Judas going?"
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of strange. That's not mentioned, is it?
No, they just thought he was going out and buying something for the festival.
I know.
But Jesus specifically says to them, and two, I think it goes to, it shows kind of like you said, it was very unique for them to have a meal with somebody. It had a great significance. I'm eating with you, but then think about just a few hours later how he betrays him.
It's amazing.
It's the kiss on the cheek, which is a show of affection, a friendship. We don't go around kissing people on the cheek. It's like a handshake, fist bump, a hug of somebody we really care about that is a friend. And Jesus says to him, friend. He calls him friend. Why does he do that? Because Jesus is a friend of sinners.
Right.
I mean, boy, this is when you see all this stuff start happening and why Jesus did this. I mean, he was so close to heaven, yet he went. And I think that's what we have to look at too, because we know he is possessed by Satan, and Satan is so close to Jesus that it's that deception, because that's why he's a liar. He is a fraud. And he can make it look so real and shiny, and then in a moment you're turned, and that's what he does. But I think too, with Judas here and how he betrays him, of course, he goes out. Jesus is still here. According to John, Judas leaves, and then Jesus starts. He tells Peter, "You're going to deny me." Peter says, "No, I'm not." And then John 14, 15, and 16 is when and then John 17, where we really, peer into, the heart of Jesus as he's praying for us. And then, in verse 18 is where, he is betrayed. And so there was a lot that happens from when Judas leaves to what's happening. What Jesus is telling him. Judas wasn't here for this. He's gone. He's out going to get the scribes and the Pharisees and the people that are coming to take Jesus off, who he made a deal with. But there's so much in John, 14, where he talks about heaven and what he's prepared. And then he talks about how there's going to be trouble, which, he knew what was coming. And he says he's given us peace. But he's also talked about how this was necessary for him to go away so the Holy Spirit could come. And so he was telling these men, these followers, these important things, that all this is necessary. And see, I don't think we really understand that, on this side of it, of how necessary all these things were. I mean, everything just fell into place in God's perfect will for it to happen the way it happened. And so, John 15, he talks about the vine and the branches and how we're to be, we can't do anything without him. And then John 16, he talks about the Spirit of God. Then he talks about how in the middle of chapter 16, how their sorrow is going to be turned to joy because he knows what's getting ready to happen. And then he ends this upper room discourse with John 17, where he's praying. We talked about not yesterday, but on Sunday, we talked about how that Jesus is interceding for us. And I believe this prayer, he's still praying for us today.
Mm-hmm. I've heard people refer to it that way.
Because this, we look at Matthew chapter 6 as the Lord's Prayer, but really that's a model prayer. This right here is the Lord's Prayer. This is really kind of into the prayer life of Jesus. And not only is he praying for his disciples then, he's praying for us right now. And as I said on Sunday, this prayer that he's praying as he intercedes for us, he's praying that God will be glorified, that we will be sanctified, and the church will be unified. And boy, what a powerful statement he leaves behind. He wants them to be unified because he knows that's the only way that they can accomplish what he's left them here to do is them by them being unified. And that's why we have to be together as a church. That's why it's so important. And then he leaves the upper room. And, of course, during this whole thing, he institutes the Lord's Supper. Let's talk just a little bit about the difference of what the Last Supper and the Lord's Supper, because a lot of people get it confused. But the Last Supper he was having, and it looks like it's like in the middle of it, he pauses. and he institutes this Lord's Supper that we know that he left as an ordinance for the church to follow and to observe.
A lot of symbolism in the elements of that Last Supper and what it meant to the Jews. And, some people observe it. Christians observe what we refer to as a Seder, where they take the elements of the Passover meal and basically talk about how everything was ultimately fulfilled through the person of Jesus Christ. It's a beautiful, beautiful picture of how everything centered around him and pointed toward him. But you're right about that. It was an honor to be able to gather together with those whom you were close to and celebrate Passover and what that meant. But you're right. Somewhere in the midst of that Last Supper with his closest followers, then it's like Jesus kind of puts a semicolon in the midst of the flow of the meal.
Yeah. It says right here, one of my notes, it says, "Can you imagine the tension in the room, the way the dust must have hung silently, suspended in the candlelight, the creak of the floorboards if anyone dares shifted their weight whenever Jesus began to spoke?" And start that.
Yep. And when he did that, he took the elements that they had, specific to bread and the cup, and he began to expound on how this is going to mean something different from now on. And
and he didn't partake of that. He didn't eat that. He ate the Last Supper meal with him.
He couldn't, and he won't. Hadn't yet.
And he hadn't yet.
Yeah.
But yeah, and that's the thing. He and what it symbolized. And on Sunday we had communion on Palm Sunday. We like doing it on that day. And a year ago we had it on Good Friday, which I thought was very powerful to actually observe communion, because it's really remembering his sacrifice. And it's one of the two ordinances that the Lord left for the church, and that Paul records is what we're to do. It's the Lord's Supper and it's baptism. And both of them are a picture of the gospel, of what Jesus did for us. But the Lord's Supper, I mean, if you could imagine, this is the night before, this was on the same night he was betrayed. And so, in our minds, it was, Thursday, afternoon, evening, getting close to that 6 p.m. time is what we know, because it's not like, and what was getting ready to happen after that from 6 a.m., overnight, what the things that was getting ready to happen was that he was on trial at night. So in the dark, when nobody knew what was going on, everybody was going to bed. Jesus was on trial, kind of hidden in the shadows, because they knew what would happen if it was in public.
That is such a great context to this whole thing, because it was a sham. It went along with nothing that the Jews considered to be above board litigation. It was not.
Right.
And what they were doing, like you say, had to be done undercover and pretty much out of the earshot of most folks, because they were fearful of an uprising and what could happen.
Yeah. And so they were, Jesus institutes this Lord's Supper, and, as he breaks the bread. Now, we know his bones were not broken, because the Bible prophesied none of his bones would be broken, but his body was beaten and bruised and broken open, because the Bible records, and we'll talk a little bit more about it on Good Friday, but when he breaks the bread, he tears that piece of bread in two, portraying what is going to be happening to his body. He knows, he sees. They talk about when Jesus was 12 years old. I heard this talked about. They was a man that crucified Jews, and on the way as Jesus was walking, to the temple with his family, is he would see those, because there was a madman and that was doing that to the Jews, and he would see it, and he knew in a few years that's what he was going to be doing for us. And so when he was ripped that bread, he said, "This is my body which is broken for you," and then he knew the blood that he was going to shed, and so he institutes that, and then he goes to, he leaves the upper room, and he goes to a place called Gethsemane. and it's a place called the wine press where they crushed the grapes. You know, and we talked a little bit on Sunday when we'd done the Lord's Supper. You know, Jesus left and sang a hymn on the way to Gethsemane, and many people believe it's from Psalm 115 to 118. It's probably one of the Psalms, or all the Psalms. I don't know how many they sung, but when you read those Psalms, it's powerful to think about what the disciples and Jesus was singing as he's on his way to start being crushed for us and to pay our sin debt. I mean, you know, a lot of people just think, well, on Good Friday's when the suffering happened. Oh, no, it was happening on that night that he is betrayed. And so he's there with his disciples. He has been, you know, he's getting ready to be betrayed by Judas. They're there praying. And, you know, it says that he is under such a weight in that garden that he really like falls down under just the crushing weight of what he's getting ready to do. I mean, it's a powerful thing that he says he's almost at the point of death, and he needs his disciples to pray with him. Of course, he takes, you know. So here's the thing: Judas knew where he would be. That's what's crazy, is that he knew where he would be, because he'd been there before with Jesus, I believe. And so Judas, of course, he's getting everybody together, and he gives them a sign, the one I kiss on the cheeks, that's the one you need to arrest. And so, you know, but as they're praying, you know, it says in Matthew, it says he's greatly grieved to the point of death. It says he went a little farther and he fell down and began to pray. And he prays this, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. And what people need to understand, he's not praying, let me do it another way. He's praying that he don't want to become sin.
Ooh. And with that,
yeah.
Oh my goodness. It's not just, okay. For years and years, I've heard people say it, and I've said it myself, I guess, that Jesus took upon himself the sin of the world. Mm-hmm. Okay, in principle, okay, we can walk with that. Mm-hmm. It actually goes further than that. It's not that he took upon himself the sin of the world. He became sin. Mm-hmm. And you were describing this when you spoke on Sunday about this emotional, spiritual workup that had Jesus to the point to where sweat and blood began to mix, and he started to emit this mixture, this blood and sweat mixture out of his pores, his skin pores. Mm-hmm. There is a condition that is referred to as hematidrosis, and it can happen, but it is as a result of an unimaginable, intense workup within like that. Some people have asked the question, okay, what about it? Was it the suffering? Was it the punishment? I think you just hit the nail on the head there. But even in addition to becoming sin, Jesus, as a result of that, would experience something that had never happened. And I believe when he, in a spiritual and figurative sense, when Jesus was looking into that cup that he was referring to, you know, what Jesus saw was separation from his Father for the very first time.
Yep.
Father could not bear to look upon sin, of which Jesus became for us. Mm-hmm. That, I believe, was what unnerved Jesus more than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, just the horrific, you think about the horrific sins of the past, 40 million people or billion people that's been on the planet, I guess, 40 billion.
Can we even say that adequately?
No, I mean, we don't even understand it, but just think about the horrific, I mean, okay, lying, you know, stealing, okay, that's fine, but think about the horrific sins.
Right. Heinous crimes.
Yeah.
Yes.
He's becoming every bit of that, but yet it wasn't that he was willing to do that. He didn't want to be separated from his Father.
No.
Because that's what sin does. No matter what kind of sin it is, sin separates. And he had never been separated before. And he knew when he becomes sin, that's why he cried out, my God, why
Where
have
are
you
you?
forsaken? Where are you at, God?
Yes.
Like he was totally abandoned.
Right.
And he did it just for us. I mean, that's what we're talking about on Friday. But, I mean, then you look at what happens here when he comes. I mean, his sweat became drops of blood. He's praying for you. He's begging his disciples to pray. And then what happens is here comes Judas. And it says, his betrayer had given them a sign, the one I kiss, he's the one, arrest him. So immediately he went up to Jesus and said, greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. Friend, Jesus asked him, why have you come? And they came up, took hold of Jesus, and arrested him. In that moment, one of those with Jesus reached out his hand and drew his sword. We know it was Simon Peter, because Mark tells us that. And he was ready to fight. I really believe that Peter thought and he wanted to follow Jesus the whole way and go to, but his flesh gave in and he cowered away and he was in fear. But, I mean, this leading up, and of course we know what happens is then it begins a night. You know, it's hard kind of for us to understand like the night and day because it was 12 hours.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, we look at this night, you know, it's like 9 p.m., 10 p.m. at night. And it's okay for us to understand it that way, but it was in the dark hours of night and morning that all this stuff is going on. And we can talk a little bit more about it tomorrow as we get into really what Jesus suffered for us.
The time of day we normally refer to as those wee hours of the morning.
Yeah, and Jesus is now on trial. He is taken, and of course we'll look at how he's beaten, how he's scourged. Jesus is not only betrayed, now he is forsaken. Peter denies him. And then he is getting ready to take on the punishment for our sins. And so that's what we'll talk about on tomorrow's episode on Good Friday. So we hope that you'll join us tomorrow. It's going to be a special day. And so we thank you for tuning in today on the Overflow Podcast. Please share it with someone. We'll see you tomorrow on Good Friday. God bless you.